Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's JNF Connect webinar, looking at the future of the South African Jewish community. I would like to acknowledge our friends at MDA who have their campaign this week and wish them b'hatzlacha. My name is Dan Springer, for those who I haven't met. I'm CEO of JNF Australia, and our mission is to ensure the strength and sustainability of Israel and our Zionist community here in Australia. Having said that, we cannot ignore the plight of our brothers and sisters in another community, the South African community, not only because a large proportion of our own community have direct family ties, but because of the principle of Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Lazeh. All of Israel, all of Jews are connected with one another and responsible for one another. Tonight's panel will address the extreme challenges facing the South African community and how they're addressing those. And we could think of nobody better to moderate that discussion than Steve Lindy. Steve has been a key player and commentator on Israel and Jewish affairs and the relationship with the diaspora in his many roles, including as Jerusalem Post editor from 2011 to 2016, and since then as Jerusalem Report editor. Steve began his long media career in radio, first as a broadcaster and then as director of Israel Radio's English News, before joining the Post in 1997. Born in Harare, he grew up in Durban and has graduate degrees in sociology and journalism from the University of KZN and UC Berkeley. Steve made Aliyah in 1987, coincidentally the same year that I did, before serving in the IDF Artillery Corps, and lives in Jerusalem. I first got to know Steve in 2014 when he spoke at our annual gala dinners around the country and was very well received by our Sydney, Melbourne and Perth communities. Talking of gala dinners, our annual event will be virtual again this year. We were overwhelmed by the feedback from last year's event and confident that you will again be inspired, entertained, and hopefully uplifted by this year's virtual gala. It's going to be a very special one in honor of JNF's 120th birthday, with a great lineup of speakers that will be announced at the beginning of September. So please save the date for October the 5th at 8 p.m. And it now gives me great pleasure to cross live to Steve in Jerusalem, who will introduce the panel and take us through the rest of the evening. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you so much, Dan, and shalom, and how's it to you all from Jerusalem? I'd like to especially welcome our panelists, Riva Foreman, Dr. Daniel Israel, Mike Abel, and Mary Klook. And thank you all for joining us wherever you are in Australia, South Africa, Israel, and around the world. The topic, as you know, is the civil unrest that broke out in South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal, from the 9th to the 17th of July, did raise concern among all of us, and especially the Jewish community. It was apparently triggered by the incarceration of former President Jacob Zuma, and the resulting protests against his imprisonment led to rioting and looting, fueled by job layoffs and economic inequality, which was exacerbated, of course, by the COVID-19 pandemic. The unrest then spread to Gauteng and was the worst violence that South Africa has experienced since the collapse of apartheid, but it seems to have dwindled, thankfully, now. The Jewish community, which according to the Kaplan Center now numbers about 50,000, rallied to help all those in need, collected funds, and even airlifted supplies of food and medicine, especially to the sick and elderly who couldn't go out due to COVID. At the same time, we also witnessed an increase in Aliyah, with some 87 Olim coming to Israel from South Africa just last week. A new TV series produced by Mark Wade coincidentally started last month, called Legends and Legacies, telling the amazing story of really an amazing Jewish community whose numbers are unfortunately appear to be dwindling. So what is the future of the South African Jewish community? Let's go right into it and start with you, Riva Foreman, in Johannesburg. You are the Managing Director of Riva Beauty and Health, a long-serving member of the SAJBD Gauteng Council, a National Executive Committee member, an Honorary Life Vice President of the South African Zionist Federation, Chairperson of Temple Israel Hillbrow, and in 2019 you were made an Honorary Life member of the World Zionist Organization, receiving the coveted Amit Kavod Award. So Riva, tell us What's the situation today? How do you see it from where you're sitting?
Thank you so much, and for that nice introduction as well. I'd forgotten about half those things. Thanks. Thanks, Steve. Well, you know, I am in Gauteng, and the main brunt and the main terror and the main horror really hit Natal. So I know Mary, who is in Natal, will be sharing this with you. But even in Gauteng, yes, we experienced 10 days of something that we'd never known before, a fear that we'd never known before. Because at the heart of this, we all knew that this was a euphemism. The word insurrection is a euphemism for an intended coup that had been threatened should Zuma and his ANC cronies and family and others be held accountable for the total destruction they achieved through corruption and other means in the 10 years when he was in power. But yes, it was a terrifying 10 days, yet I must remind you that to me, South Africa, like Israel, has something miraculous, because when we saw, after real fear and terror, I've never known that before, but when we saw the citizens themselves, fellow South Africans, black, white, young, old, Indian, irrespective of where they came from, come together after the total shock of the initial days and the looting and the destruction, come out in the face of an inept police force to come and protect their buildings, their shopping centers. And then only later were they joined by the army. I knew that the miracle that we saw in this country in the Madiba era is still alive. That spirit in the South Africans, and particularly in the born frees that we thought didn't really relate to the Mandela era. It was a young born free in Soweto who actually tweeted and said, come and help, and on Facebook. So although, yes, we went through a terrible time, tragically 300 lives were lost. Natal and Durban suffered the most, and their trauma is something that I can't mirror. But for me, in the heart of this absolute unexpected or expected tragedy and disaster, the South African spirit has come back. And it's the people in the street, the man, the woman, the people in the street. This is the era where leadership is in the hands of the man in the street. And it's, to me, this is an incredible beginning of a new era where the voice of the people will be heard. And we are reclaiming our democracy, and we are demanding that from our government, who I must say the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has a really tough job on his hands. But I'd like now to give the other panelists a chance to speak. So from my point of view, I'm an entrepreneur, I take risks, and I would still take every risk that I have on South Africa as a proud Jew, Zionist, and South African.
Well, thank you, Riva, for that very positive opening. And I forgot to mention that if you do have questions for our panelists or comments, please write them in the chat section at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be happy at the end of the discussion to relay some of them. Dr. Daniel Israel, if I can go to you now, you're a family practitioner in Johannesburg. You've been outspoken in the media, especially about the spread and prevention of COVID. You're a regular contributor to the South African Jewish Report, and I read your last column just a few days ago titled, I think, Getting Your COVID-19 Jab is a Duty, Not a Right. With that background, tell us from your perspective how you see things at the moment.
Thanks for having me on the panel. I think that, I mean, I certainly have a bit of a skewed view because of the work that I do. But I certainly think that COVID-19 is the biggest factor here and the biggest challenge that we have as a community in South Africa. and that doesn't make light of the situation in terms of the rioting and the main topic of tonight's talk. But we've got to remember that we've got a serious problem in this country in that we've got high levels of transmission of COVID-19, something that compared to the Australian side is like unimaginable. And we have a very arguably inefficient rollout of vaccines in South Africa. And we are now dealing with another whole sentiment, which I suppose exists everywhere in the world, but of people who are either anti-vaxxers or in most cases in South Africa are just too afraid and don't have the knowledge to understand. So they don't see the immediate effects of everyone getting COVID, getting very sick, and they would rather not put something foreign into their body. So while this whole rioting situation happened, of course, I mean, we saw this with doctors' rooms were affected, and there were practitioners who couldn't open, and thankfully the hospitals still got the medication that they needed and the supplies that they needed. But I think that it almost became a huge distraction away from this massive problem that we have of trying to get on top of this COVID curve and just set us back further. So, I mean, certainly from our side, that's the point where I feel like our community really needs to focus at the moment, and I feel as though we are doing so. But I'll stop there, and you'll come back to this, I'm sure, later.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. And Mike Abel, you're a founding partner and chief executive officer of MNC Saatchi Abel and MNC Saatchi Group in South Africa. You're which is one of Africa's leading marketing, advertising, and communications specialists. Last month, Mike posted a heartfelt open letter to South African expats living abroad, which quickly went viral. I think 100 people sent it to me on WhatsApp. And you chose to return to South Africa, you point out, after immigrating to Australia in 2008, because you love the country and you missed it. And I'm wondering now, are you pleased you went back to South Africa? And how do you see the future of South African Jewry there?
Thank you, Stephen, and good evening to everyone watching. I think that I haven't, I guess, regretted for a day my decision, A, to leave, and B, to come back. So I think both of them were motivated by different things. Why I left South Africa was we had an armed robbery while I was on holiday with my wife and children in Nelson Mandela Bay. For those that you don't know, that's Port Elizabeth, or Quebec as it's now called. And that precipitated my decision to leave. And simultaneously and fortuitously, I was approached by the MNC Saatchi Group Australia to head their group of agencies based in Sydney, with agencies in Melbourne. And taking nothing away from Sydney or Australia, I absolutely loved living in Sydney, and I loved visiting Melbourne. But what became very apparent, particularly to my wife, actually, as soon as we got there, is that we had left behind everything that we know and love for everything that we didn't. And it's not to say that it's not a remarkable country and that people who have decided to immigrate and who are very happy there, that's a lovely thing. But we found the physical distance away from family and friends to be brutally difficult. And then the MNC Saatchi Group, based out of London, Lord Saatchi approached me and asked if I would set up South Africa as part of my region. He didn't expect me to go back. I'd be doing that remotely from Australia. And we thought it was too good an opportunity not to be reunited with our family and not to come back and do something different. But in coming back to South Africa, Stephen, what I did decide is, although I've always been very involved in fighting injustice in South Africa throughout my career. I mean, my first ad agency I started was during apartheid, out of the townships in Nelson Mandela Bay, operating out of Jewry, KwaZulu, New Brighton and Motherwell, which was quite unusual for a young Jewish boy during those days to be operating out of the townships. But I knew in coming back that I wanted to lead a far more purposeful life and to make a far greater contribution to job creation, to upliftment, and to being an activist, if you like. And so my return has been filled with, I guess, a much greater personal purpose than I guess before I left, which was maybe more commercial in orientation. So when I have a look at what happened last week 2 weeks ago, I'll say the following. One is, many of us grew up in South Africa where 90% of the population was suppressed and where we lived a very glorious life on top of a powder keg of suppression. And a lot of people decided to leave South Africa when the new democracy began, which was the first time ever that 90% of the population were unlocked and given an opportunity to participate in the economy of South Africa. So people who didn't feel during the 70s and 80s that they were living in a disastrous situation, I find that questionable, because that is when South Africa was at its most dangerous, not what happened 2 weeks ago in South Africa. Now, why did that happen in South Africa? And as Riva said earlier, absolutely, Jacob Zuma was the flame, but the firewood was poverty. The firewood is a 35% unemployment level in South Africa and 70% youth unemployment. That is not a sustainable situation. So while Daniel, and I understand where he's coming from, looks at COVID as being the crisis in our country, I look at unemployment as being the crisis in our country. And unless we unlock the economy, unless we develop a sharing economy and an inclusive culture, we will not be able to fix the country. But I'm confident that this crisis has precipitated a new opportunity for South Africa.
Thank you, Mike. And I see that any technical problems we've had have now been sorted out in the chat, and that we have something like 613 participants, almost like the number of mitzvot in the Torah. Mary Kluk, you're a Durbanite like me, and you're national president of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, an executive member of the World Jewish Congress, a chair of the Africa-Australia region in the WJC, and head of the Security Committee. And as a resident of Durban, you've been very active in countering the Anti-Israel World Conference Against Racism conferences in Durban. And since all the balagan, as we say in Israel, began in Durban, it'd be interesting now to hear your perspective.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you so much for having me on the panel. First of all, I just want to make, in full disclosure, that week, that dreadful week in KZN and in Durban, I was not in Durban. So, but that doesn't mean that everybody that I love and hold dear and my colleagues, etc. And I almost felt it was more difficult not to be there. I was in Cape Town at the time because it was such a brutal time. So I just wanted to structure my comments and say that I would like to speak a little bit about the reality of what was happening on the ground in KZN, which is obviously of interest. But I wanted to begin my comments by saying thank you to the Australian community and to the over 600 people who are concerned and interested and share the welfare of us as Jews across the globe. As Steve mentioned, I'm the chair of the Africa-Australia Jewish Congress, which is one of the 6 regions of the World Jewish Congress. And it's an important region, and we have come to understand that each community is unique and has their own skills and different talents, but we often share very similar challenges. And it's wonderful to have this connection with Australia and Africa, New Zealand, and other smaller communities where we have a meaningful idea exchange and camaraderie and chavashaft. So thank you to all of you in Australia for your interest, and primarily I was on a webinar a couple of days ago with Australians, and I have such a sense of concern and care for your fellow Jews. And so from the president of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, I want to say on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for reaching out. As to what happened in Durban, it was horrid. And there were 2 particular nights and 3 days that were extremely tough, where people who were living in the area where I grew up and where most of the Jewish community resided on the Barnea were pretty much under siege. But as with everything in life, there are silver linings, and I'll come to those. But the difficulties and my role in the board became one of supporting that community in Durban who had pretty much no access to food and essential services. Petrol was very difficult, well, not available. So it depended on what petrol you had in your tank, how far you could go once it was safe to go out. people, and particularly Durban is a small dynamic community, but tiny. Many of the community are older and active retirees, but not active enough to be able to be expected to spend 8 hours in a queue for a supermarket, where when you get in, you're only allowed to choose 8 to 15 items to purchase. So our concern was that there was a cohort of people who were pretty much stranded in their own homes, very anxious, very fearful. Apparently the feeling of fear was very real and justified, and people were anxious to venture out. So we got into gear, and between the Board of Deputies in KZN, the Umhlanga Jewish Center, which is the coastal Jewish community, we airlifted food. And I know, Steve, you said so in the introduction, but the practical realities of what that involves is that Jewish businesses, Jewish cartage businesses, people with private airplanes, people were unbelievable. Just came together to say, how can we help? What can we do? We were able to bring in non-perishable goods and organize prescription medicines for people from outside of the city, from outside of the province. And over those literally 3 or 4 days, we were able to keep the community sustained in a way that was, again, something that one has to admire: the resilience, the camaraderie, the sense of being part of something wonderful as a Jewish community. And then don't let us ever forget the role that the Jewish community plays in the broader community. So many parts of our city were decimated. You can just imagine, and I don't have to remind you because there were many images on global television that made it clear how tough things are for people now in the mopping up operations. And our community has once again come to the fore in providing some. I mean, Mike demonstrated that absolutely clearly. The number of people who were struggling before we started with COVID, and then on top of it, have this dreadful insecurity, and now, job insecurity, and how to rebuild that that world that we all have seen crashing down before us. But 2 weeks later, I have to say that the situation feels, I don't know how to use the word, but it feels normal again. And human beings are incredibly resilient, and our community is remarkable. We'll never be able to unsee or unhear what we saw and heard and felt, and that will be part of the rebuilding. But when we think about, as I said, the silver linings, and I want to just mention a couple of anecdotes, one in particular. So for those of you from Durban, you'll know the area I'm talking about on the Barnea, where in St. Thomas's Road, a lot of houses next door to a church were knocked down and a mosque was planned. In the past 5 years, during the planning of this mosque, there's been an enormous amount of resistance. A very elite retirement home is across the road, and there was a huge resistance from the retirement home, the noise that would come from the call to prayer, etc. And there's been a lot of from the wrote an open letter to the mosque last week, thanking them and taking back everything they said about practice for this mosque to be there, saying that it had been for the mosque and its congregants, they would have been able to get through this time between bare essentials, milk, bread, camaraderie, support, that this aged across the road, this very exclusive home that had been, as I say, resistant is polite, they're now reaching out and saying, you are the neighbors we could ever have imagined in this time of crisis. So there are communities holding hands, there are, and everybody came together. I mean, just again, to demonstrate the facts on the ground. The civil society were literally standing watch on every street corner. By the time the government and the president has, on public television, acknowledged that to a large extent, they were caught off guard in terms of what this insurrection, how it would look like, that it would reach into suburban homes. And this neighborhood watches that came together as communities. So all of that filled me with hope about the possibility of rebuilding. As I say, you can't take away what happened. And I do want to agree with Dr. Daniel Israel and say that for our community in particular, COVID has hit us terribly, terribly hard. This past wave that we're just coming through now in Gauteng, in the Johannesburg area, has hammered the Jewish community. We have never had as many funerals and as many tough situations ever as a community. And so, you know, we're coming at it, it's a perfect storm. The socioeconomic hardship that so many people live with in South Africa, COVID and the challenges that comes in terms of managing it, and the vaccine rollout, and now this unrest has made for a really difficult, but it doesn't take away my and my absolute hope in humanity. And I think for us as South Africans, and my role personally in leadership, is that each one of us wake up every day and hope in some way to be a contribution. And how in South Africa now, we are each imbued with that opportunity to be a contribution to rebuild our country. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that very eloquent and moving, those moving remarks. We lost you a little bit in the middle, but I think you're back now. So yeah, I hope your Wi-Fi is working. I just want to open it up.
Sorry,
we sort of.
Sorry, Steve. So I'm going to turn off my video. I beg your pardon, because it might help. And sorry, just to be rude, but it'll be safer than us.
Yeah, that seems okay. That's fine. I think we're halfway through. I just wanted to open it up a little bit for discussion. If any of the panelists, before I ask questions and we take questions from the floor, would like to make remarks about something someone else said. Mike, I saw you put your hand up at one point. Did you want to say something?
No, Stephen, my hand wasn't up, but I am happy to say something. I've seen a question come through to me on the chat, which was around something that I said about poverty being the firewood, and that the observation was that there were some fancy cars spotted in part of the looting, which I'd like to respond to. And that I think that wealth and values are not necessarily related. In fact, some of the poorer people I know have got better values than people with loads of money. So I'd like to make that point. So you'll always get opportunists in life. If you were on the ground, by all accounts, the greatest looting obviously did come from those that have very little. And that is not because they are greater thieves in any way. It's simply as a factor of them being far more desperate. When you have people that don't have jobs, have no prospects, have nothing, a free-for-all, whether you are in Los Angeles, whether you are in New York during the riots there, whether you are in post-match London or anywhere around the world, the factor of looting and opportunism at a time of unrest is common, and it's the human condition. Unfortunately, it's not related to anything specific to Africa or South Africa. But the good thing about the people that did arrive in vehicles is that their license plates have been registered, and a lot of those people are being brought to book. So we had a very famous young man in South Africa, 30 years old, private school educated, that was seen coming out of Woolworths, carrying a basket full of food and putting it into the boot of his Mercedes-Benz. Within 72 hours, he was arrested. He has been charged. He was in jail for a few days. He's now out on bail. So I think what we've also seen happen is that people have been going, our police have been going to shacks and retrieving stolen items. So it's not like South Africa also said, well, c'est la vie, the stuff has been stolen, too bad. We've actually gone and actively gone to fetch that looted stuff and take it away. Sadly, it's being destroyed rather than being donated, but then I also understand donated to whom and how and based on what criteria. So a tricky time, and we're fiddling and finding our way through it.
Thanks, Mike. Riva, your hand's up. But before you actually talk, let me ask you. There was an interesting question that
Yes.
One of the people watching directed at you. What does Riva think of South Africa being one of the most anti-Israel countries in the world? What does she think of its BDS?
Yeah.
And why should anything change? From Merv Bass.
That's exactly why I put my hand up, because immediately that question came down, I wrote it down. And you know, everyone knows South Africa, Israel, particularly, and other, it's a very, very complicated reality. We've been fighting the BDS here since 2001, since the hijacked Durban Conference, Racism is Zionism. And for me, the BDS, it's brilliant to choose South Africa as ground zero, because if our government confirms the analogy with apartheid, then it gives it a gravitas it doesn't deserve. However, I have been, and Mary, I know, will have much more to say on this as well, but I've been, as you know, Steve, part of this fight against what I consider is twisting, fake news, or misinformation. It is prevalent throughout the world today. We did take the BDS on. Between all the 500-600 people I brought, including South Africa's leading political editors, who actually saw both sides of the conflict. I believe that there was, we did to a large extent, we saw a cessation of BDS work and government influence over the last few years. However, once the Zuma era started, I know, because I have proof, that certain of the ANC leadership was actually captured by the BDS as an exchange for votes. Why do I tell you this? The anti-Israel stance of the current government, which I agree is really terrible, is very much part of a very complicated issue. And it's something that I personally, as a South African Jew who is a really Meshuggah Zionist, as you know, I believe it is our duty as South Africans, in the memory of Mandela, in the memory of freedom fighters in our constitution, to fight for our rights, to be proud Zionists in this country, and we've made that quite clear. Baruch Hashem, in South Africa, one is not frightened to walk with a kippah. And there is amongst the people themselves, excluding the extreme elements in every religion, including ours, an unbelievable respect for religion. And I believe it is part of my duty as a South African Jew who's A, benefited under apartheid, B, was part of the build-up leading the excitement of understanding the Constitution and the new dispensation. So yes, there is a bad anti-Israel element at the moment. However, also this tends to go in phases. At the moment, I believe nowhere in the world is there a charismatic, powerful leader in the image of, let's say, a Nelson Mandela, a Ben Gurion, a Winston Churchill. These people don't exist. In fact, leading up to this era with Zuma, by the way, starting it, we have charismatic popularists who were through, I believe, who have more their own interests at heart, and I include America in this, I include Israel in this, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, etc., who really have wanted to stay in power rather than care about their people. This mindset will grab at any opportunity to get votes, no matter what the subject. And, we have to, as South Africans, keep reminding people that you cannot hijack Mandela's heritage and then misrepresent it. And for example, you always hear that Mandela said, yes, we will never be free unless the Palestinians are free. And they stop it there. And yet they don't complete it. He said, we will never be free unless the Palestinians are free, living side by side with a secure Jewish state of Israel. So I believe that this particular phase now, where our president has expressed very harsh anti-Israel sentiments, we must still look at the reality on the ground, because there is also an unbelievable pragmatism in our president. He's got a lot of faults, but there's not a leader today who hasn't got faults. And he was the one who just a couple of years ago resisted BDS calls, and that includes many, many in his cabinet who I believe have been captured, to close down Clover dairies because he put the creation of jobs before an ideology. And I trust that this pragmatism will come back. However, I'm going to conclude on just one note. I'm very concerned, as every Jew is, with an anti-Israel rhetoric coming out of the presidency. The Board of Deputies and the Zionist Federation have done everything they can to explain that this does lead to an increased anti-Semitism on the ground. But Baruch Hashem, the anti-Semitism that we did see a rise of, for example, during the last war with Gaza, etc., it's still less than anti-Semitism in the majority of other countries where it is very prevalent. And amongst the people on the ground, I want to say over and over again, there's an unbelievable love, particularly the Black Christian majority, for Israel as part of their biblical heritage. So I'll just conclude with one remark. Yes, we've had horrific anti-Israel statements from our president. However, when Minister Pando came to talk about the topic and confirmed the president's remark that they were pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel, at the same time, she had to say, I personally believe under the directive of the president that the ambassador would stay and the embassy in South Africa, and that the existing embassy, although downgraded, will stay in Israel. So I see this to fight for Israel's true story, to fight for the truth of two sides of a conflict. Above all, I see Ubuntu at the heart of every South African, as at the heart of our Torah. There are always two sides, and we must listen to those two sides and have compassion. So I hope that gives you some insight into my thinking, that there is still a lot of understanding in this country for Jews to fight for the right of Israel to exist, in my opinion, we hope, alongside a Palestinian state.
Okay, thank you, Riva. And I'd like to ask Mary to follow up on this. Is it possible, by the way, for you to open your video again, Mary?
Sure.
If we
let's see. Will you interrupt me if you can't hear, and then I'll switch it off. But I hope you can.
I think we can hear, and it's all good. So
Okay.
I'd like your perspective on this. Ramaphosa and his relationship with the Jewish community, but also I'll add, if you don't mind, a question from Yossi Eshed, the JNF Australia Shaliach, who says, I was an Aliyah Shaliach in 2008 to 11 in Cape Town, including the happy days of the 2010 World Cup, where everybody was very optimistic about the future of South Africa. Has South Africa missed the opportunity to use this event as a growth engine?
So I'll tackle Yossi's question first and say that sadly, 2010 was kind of the beginning of our Zuma years, which politically and economically, and for all the reasons we all understand, were incredibly draining on the country. So it took a hammer, you know, the economy took a hammering, there was no growth. If there was a 1% growth in the economy at all over each year, it was a lot. So that's pretty much what happened to that incredible euphoria. People in South Africa are extraordinarily resilient, and there's always the hope and optimism that it's not as bad as we've come to understand it was in terms of the Zuma years. But Cyril Ramaphosa, as was a question I saw in the chat, was the reference to it being a tough job. He does have a difficult job, as I said, between a country that has enormous socioeconomic hardship and poverty and joblessness, and so much hope in those aspiring young people for jobs for themselves and an opportunity to take themselves out of poverty that hasn't been possible because of the lack of growth in our economy. So there's a lot of challenges, but in terms of the issue with anti-Semitism and the South African Jewish community and where that leads us as far as the anti-Israel sentiment, I won't repeat what Riva has said, but the interesting thing is we have one of the lowest levels of anti-Semitism in the world. We obviously track those with the Tel Aviv University every quarter, and our numbers are considerably less than any other country. But we have that juxtaposed with a relationship between the ANC and what was the PLO in the days of the struggle, where the politicians of old would tell us that they shared a fax machine with the PLO in Lusaka. There's a close affiliation and relationship between the ANC and the PLO. And I saw somebody mention the apartheid government with the previous, with the Israeli government at the time. So it's a complex relationship. There is no tolerance for, and a zero tolerance for any form of prejudice. And we have court cases as the board in courts at the moment. We're waiting for a judgment on hate speech around Zionism and a particular Bongani Masuku that we're waiting for a judgment this week from the Constitutional Court. We've just had a restraining order put on a awful right-wing Nazi sympathizer, well, actually a Nazi, I would like to call him, Mr. Jan Lamprecht, on Thursday. We've had incredible successes in the courts because of this zero tolerance for prejudice and hatred. But there is obviously a frustration on behalf of our government with Israeli politics, and it's our responsibility at the Board of Deputies to make sure that criticism of this Israeli government or any Israeli government or any government doesn't become anti-Semitism. And the difficulty for us is that the criticism of Israel in a community that is so deeply Zionist, and for all of us, somehow our identity is tangled up in the state of Israel. It's very difficult not to feel targeted as a Jewish community when your beloved state of Israel is being so maligned. So we tackle BDS and we leave no stone unturned to ensure that we expose them for the anti-Semites we believe they are. And we've had many examples, including a pig's head in Woolworths, where they thought it was a kosher counter, and many, Israel Apartheid Week, the infamous Israel Apartheid Week, they've exposed themselves. The interesting part is that our president, through this recent conflict, and I think all diaspora communities, from my work at the World Jewish Congress, I'm acutely aware, all diaspora communities struggle when there's heightened conflict in the Middle East. And for us, that is always a very difficult time. And we did have increased incidents and social media. I think we can't have this conversation without making it clear that social media has made it much more difficult. Every man and his phone is a journalist and is able to spew as much hatred as they choose through social media. And so we're working, and through the Security Committee at the World Jewish Congress, we're working round the clock with service providers in terms of social media to make sure that we try and do everything we can to limit what is allowed and what can be. Because in South Africa, the hate speech legislation is being fine-tuned at the moment. And whilst we all respect freedom of speech, we believe it cannot be unlimited. So we are in a difficult situation in South Africa where the president has come out. He writes a weekly letter to his fellow South Africans and to all of us. And at the time of the conflict, his letter was very focused on his abhorrence with what was happening in the conflict. And he wrote it from a very personal perspective. He wrote about his own experience as a young man and as his family having to be forcibly removed from their home. It's very difficult to argue with a president who speaks about his own personal experience in that way and endorses an analogy that we found so toxic about Israel being an apartheid state. So we have our work cut out for us, but we do, as a community, juxtaposed to that, have an amazing relationship with the president, and there is a deep respect for the contribution of the Jewish community to our democracy. But I'm not pretending that it's simple. And we're in the middle of a discussion at the leadership, with our leadership at the moment about how we should be navigating this, because our relationship with government is really important, but we are obviously very disappointed with the I don't know if any of you saw the interview on French television that President Ramaphosa gave, where it's a passion of his that Israel is behaving in a way that brings him to criticize it very, very harshly. And we are in the process of writing a letter at the moment, which we'll be putting together with all Jewish communities, the Fed, etc., across the board, to express our disappointment, particularly now in the criticism of Israel being made an observer at the AU. So, it's not for the faint-hearted, but let me not pretend that it doesn't come with enormous rewards. Being part of this very dynamic, the Jewish life in South Africa is extraordinary, as you all know. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope you could hear.
Yeah, we could. Thank you so much. Mike, I know you put your hand up, but let me give Daniel before I give you the final word, a chance to say something. Daniel, you come across as so rational and you're so level-headed. Let me ask you this: Ramaphosa's handling, the government's handling of COVID-19, not that any government has done so well, but doesn't really seem to have been so great. I don't know what kind of marks you give it. I read a study also by David Graham, who's based in Australia, saying that something like 42% of South African Jews are considering moving either to Israel or maybe to Australia. What do you find amongst your friends? Are you staying? Are you making plans to leave? Has the situation with COVID inspired you to leave or to stay?
Yes, I mean, first of all, it's really inspiring hearing all the positive sentiments from the other speakers, and I think that there's a lot of truth and really hitting on the reality about what makes South Africans unique in what all three other speakers have said. But I think it's important, especially for our expats and the community in general in Australia, to realize, just how, certainly I feel, how locked down our community is at the moment compared to what it usually is. And Mary spoke about how wonderful and unique the South African Jewish community is, and that's true. But since the beginning of COVID, I mean, I don't think there's been a shul kiddush across South Africa, maybe one or two dodgy illegal ones. But besides that, I mean, there is no semblance of communal life face-to-face. Zoom is wonderful, and I've run meetings and been involved in things, and it's been so inspiring. But at the end of the day, we're in a situation where we really are finding that because, where I feel from the outside to me that Australia's been created itself thankfully a bubble where there could be some normalcy in life. We haven't been able to do that in South Africa, and particularly in these peaks. I mean, in this last peak, we've got people who come into my rooms here and say, like, I haven't been out for 6 weeks, and these are isolated people. So I must say that, and this is why I said at the beginning that I think COVID-19 is our biggest challenge on a community level, because I think that what's happening because of this COVID-19 is that we are actually losing touch with the greater ability of being together and of being able to have events and things like that. Now, in terms of the government's approach, as you rightly say, it's not such an easy, I don't know if there's a lot of criticism out there about how badly the government's done, but at the end of the day, the problem is bigger than, is a formidable problem. And how do you vaccinate and isolate millions of South Africans who, many of whom are very poorly educated? and manage that effectively. And I don't know whether any government in this kind of situation would have been able to do that, especially with the cultural norms that exist and people's ideas about COVID and vaccination. Certainly, I mean, I have seen for a couple of years a flow of people who have come to, I mean, I'm on the medical side. So often when people leave the country, they come to me to get their final scripts or letters or whatever. And I have seen that flow of people over the last few years. I must say that over COVID, it has gotten a bit bigger, but remember, there's restrictions are keeping people at bay as well. So I think there's almost this mindset in South Africa at the moment of let's wait till COVID's over and then we'll make a decision as to whether we should stay or not. The problem is that I don't know when COVID will be over. Certainly, there is positivity. The positivity is that we are, I mean, certainly on a Jewish community scale, we if there was a proper study done, and maybe Mary and her team will do that at some point, but we definitely have a very high percentage of vaccinated people compared to the average South Africans out there, because the Jewish community has taken up the opportunity, found ways around the problems, found ways to get vaccines. But the reality is that even so, we're not isolated enough as a community to be influenced on a virological level from the people who are non-Jewish people who haven't been vaccinated, and there's still a big percentage of those people. So as far as I'm concerned, we're deep into COVID, and COVID is really what's shutting down Jewish life at the moment, more than things like government sentiment towards Jews in Israel. And I mean, I don't think anybody feels at particular risk being part of a Jewish communal life because of these latter issues. I think that the risk people feel on every day is, how do I stop myself from getting COVID? And certainly that to me has been a big issue. And I actually wanted to ask Mark, but I don't know if this would be the time, is from a business perspective, how he sees us actually getting past this one day, because we certainly need to procure many more vaccines and change many more South African minds in order to actually be able to open up more. But that is our old discussion in itself.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. And Mike, yes, find the final word. The floor is yours.
So I'll speak to three things very quickly. The one, Daniel, to respond directly to you, I was on a webinar which Riva referred to earlier with Adrian Gore last Thursday, where Adrian spoke about how, despite the fact that we were very delayed in getting going, the current level of 200,000 plus vaccines a day, getting up to 300,000, it seems like finally we will be at a level at which we can start vaccinating people meaningfully. And then the very big job of, I guess, having the conversation with people about a vaccine not being a personal choice at all. I saw somebody on Twitter saying a vaccine is a personal decision, is saying it's fine to set your apartment alight in a block of flats. And nobody else should worry about that, because the reality is mutation. And you live in this world and I don't live in this world, but obviously we all know that the more people that get vaccinated, the quicker, the more chance we have. So a big job around education, and I'm delighted that Adrian and Discovery and the other businesses are well across that in terms of hopefully fast tracking it to a level at which life can return to, I guess, whatever this new normal is of COVID living permanently or lurking amongst us in whatever shape or form. I don't know if you saw that thing about Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, a Chinese man, ex-Port Elizabeth, coming back to South Africa now with a new COVID drug, which takes advantage of his learnings within cancer. He developed the drug Abraxane, and he's investing 3 billion rand in South Africa and is starting a plant here to develop this new variant. So it'd be great. I can actually shoot you the link on that if you haven't seen it. I'm sure it'd be absolutely fascinating for you to see what he is doing there. And he brings formidable firepower, being one of the wealthiest men in America. And he's bringing that expertise to South Africa. That's the first one answered. Second one answered, I just want to talk very quickly about anti-Semitism in Israel, because I live a lot in this space as well and do a lot of work independently of the different organizations, but Mary's obviously very aware of a lot of what I do. There isn't a dotted line between anti-Israel, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It's one line, it's a straight line, there are no dots. So let's be clear about that. Israel is held to an entirely different standard to any other country in the world. You can see that the United Nations Human Rights Council will issue 70 condemnations against Israel in any given year, and the greatest perpetrators of crimes against humanity get a free pass every single year. You've got to look at that, and I mean, it's self-evident what's going on over there. You look at the mainstream media. If I weren't Jewish and if I weren't a Zionist and I watched BBC, I watched CNN, I watched Al Jazeera, I would also have a biased view towards Israel, because you don't get to see anything other than toxic filth that they decide to share. So there is no balanced view coming from mainstream media. So the Jewish community needs to do a much better job at educating the global community. The last point on that is the Jewish community needs to do a far better educational job on educating their own community, because the Israel that unites us globally is now being used as the Israel that divides us globally. When you have a look at what's happening within the Democratic Party, and when you have a look at what's happening in the left, in Jewish circles in America, Israel is now being used very cunningly and very cleverly to divide the Jewish community. And they need a big giant wake-up call and an education process going on there to tell people exactly what's going on, because those people that are judging Israel have never raised a word about the Uyghur Muslims and what's happening to them in China or any other thing that's happening in the world. They've never commented on anything other than what happens in Israel with the Palestinian crisis, and not understanding the dynamics of that. Last one is answering a question that was put on the chat box, which is about, can we expect people to invest in South Africa given the current level of unrest? And the answer is no. That's a simple answer. If you are going to invest in a country, both domestically and internationally, you need stability. You need a fertile environment for return on investment. And that is the strong message that needs to be delivered to President Ramaphosa and to the Department of Trade and Industry, is that people should not be expected to invest in South Africa unless there is stability and unless people can see a predictable return on investment. And the only way South Africa is going to fix its troubles is also far greater reliance between government, public and private partnerships, because the expertise is not within government, it's within private business. And until the South African government and the ANC unlocks meaningful public-private partnerships, we can't win, because there aren't the experienced people capable of solving the problems in government. But they're brilliant minds in South Africa, and if they open up the government to those minds, and they are not white minds, they are black minds, black business people in South Africa, Indian business people, colored business people, and white business people who collectively can make a massive difference to South Africa if they're allowed to.
Thank you so much, Mike. And this has really been a fascinating discussion. I'd like to turn over now to Justine Williams from JNF Australia to thank everyone for participating.
Thank you, Steve, for moderating this really, really fascinating session. I'm a recent immigrant, and I'm still struggling to find any rechte Aussies in Sydney's eastern suburbs. It's clear that the future for South African Jewry is bright. It's wonderful to hear positivity emanating from the panel, and you guys are a great representation of the spirit and tenacity of the amazing South African community. We truly appreciate you giving of your time to speak with us today. The Australian Jewish community is an extension of the South African Jewish community, and with Israel as a common thread, we're one big family. With a uniquely South African ability to laugh through the most challenging of situations, we know this too shall pass. So thank you again, and lehitraot.
Thank you all. Shalom from Jerusalem.